Thank you all. So, since morning we have been discussing about DRR, and we know the infrastructure systems are inherently complex, given that many different components and subsystems that they interact with, and also multiple stakeholders. The complexity makes it more difficult and accurately assess all potential risk and also their interactions, given the limited access to right information at the right given time. So this gap will lead to missed opportunities and of course also make things much more complex in terms of rehabilitation and also response. Therefore, there is a need for comprehensive disaster risk information that can be used by different stakeholders and also across different sectors. To unbundle this complex landscape and also to provide insight into what is emerging and what is possible, but more importantly, what G20 countries can plan to achieve collectively, we have with us our keynote speaker, Mr. Aromar Ravi. Mr. Aromar Ravi is the founding director of the Indian Institute of Human Settlements and a global expert on implementing sustainable development. He was the co-chair of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, coordinating lead author for the Chapter 18 on Climate Resilient Development Pathways of the IPCC Assessment Report 6, and also the project director of the Synthesis Chapter of the flagship global report on disaster and climate resilience infrastructure. He was also the member of International Science Council Working Group on the midterm review of the Sendai Framework. May I invite Mr. Aromar Ravi to the stage to give his keynote address. Please.
Afternoon, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just sort of hope to start this off, and I've been asked to be mildly provocative, and I'll try and do that as quickly as I can. I've been asked to answer sort of three questions, and I'll sort of close one of the three first, and then I'll deal with the other two. The first one, of course, is what kind of disaster risk information infrastructure will be required for planning and decision making, and I'll deal with that in some detail later. But the key question there is, before you can start planning for a system that addresses these kind of questions, wherever it is, at the city scale, at the sort of sub-national scale, national scale, or regionally, you have to be clear what you're doing with it. What are the objectives that you're trying to meet? And I'll come to that in a second. The second is a sort of trick question, but having worked in this area for a long time, I can quickly try and answer it. And that is whether current infrastructure investments around climate risk are adequate or not. And I say it very simply, I can answer that very quickly. They aren't, because climate risk is very poorly understood and integrated into processes at the moment. We know that from the numbers. If you look at climate finance, adaptation, which is what we're considering a lot here. What is in the climate space is sort of deals with physical risk as opposed to transition risk, which is the mitigation side, is less than 10% of the financing. And one of the core reasons for that is that resources don't flow into a sector in which you're actually not able to aggregate risk information. So I would say, apart from not having good enough framework to deal with this, in the climate space, we do not have adequate risk aggregation. This is the biggest challenge we have in the adaptation space. And this is very critical because, as many of you know, we are pretty much headed towards a 1.5 overshoot. We may be hitting a 2-degree overshoot in the next decade or so, and that's quite important for the disaster risk community. So that's a quick answer to the climate question. And the third one is, what kind of data do you need? And there again, it depends on what you're trying to do. So, before I go into answering the first and the second question about what kind of infrastructure, what kind of data systems that you have and you need, I'll basically say that in this room, or within the countries in the room, we have solved many of these issues individually and in fragments. So if you're able to bring stuff together, it can actually work, and I'll give you two concrete examples. CDRI is actually putting together the first global assessment of disaster risk as far as infrastructure is concerned. It's a systematic piece of work. It's been building on 20 years of work that many of us have been doing in the risk space now across the UN system and other such things. So that's an aggregation. But 20 years ago, I led a process which looked at one of India's provinces at that particular point of time. Our current Prime Minister was the Chief Minister. And pretty much all of the questions that we've been hearing, I guess, over the last 2 days were addressed across key infrastructure elements. This is 20 years ago. The state of 60 million people was broken down into 226 entities. We built a macro model which linked it to macroeconomic processes. We were able to look at risk compression, investments across all critical infrastructures. The only thing that we didn't do at that time was look adequately at climate, because the climate models were not good enough and downscaled enough to deal with that. And pretty much all the hazards we're talking about were dealt with, including others that we're not talking about just now, which include chemical accidents. So it's possible to do it. It's been done in this country before, and I've seen it as many as you have in various locations. I know that certainly in China, where I've seen this thing happening, in many parts of the EU, in a somewhat more fragmented way in the US, this kind of stuff is possible. So it's possible, this has been done. It's just that we have to bring together these models and these processes, connect it with ongoing things that are sitting with Sendai, and of course community-based processes. So let me step back and give you a context of what I was saying in terms of how do you scope this question, how do you scope this problem. So we are, the globe at the moment is, got an economic size of about 100 trillion. That's what global economic output is. So 8 billion people produce about 100 trillion worth of output. You divide one by the other and you get a per capita, whatever it is, global world product of about $12,500. India's as a benchmark at about 2,600. So even within the G20, you can see there's a huge variation. So dealing with inequality in terms of resources, in terms of context is quite important. So the cost of a loss of life in a $500 per capita economy versus a $50,000 per capita economy is going to be different if you use conventional systems of fiduciary risk assessment. So I'm just giving you, a benchmark number that's there. So $100 trillion economy, growing at about 2.5%, fine, assuming that it will. Of course, we know that shocks are coming. Means that by 2050, we're going to reach about $185 trillion, fine, as a total economic size. Why am I giving you this number? Because the current estimates that we're putting together, and I think the CDRI report is going to be quite important in this, speak to the fact that currently, if you add both buildings and infrastructure together, the compression you get in economic output is about 1%. So basically, in a $100 trillion economy, you're losing about a trillion, a little bit more, 1.1 trillion, if I remember the number correctly, as far as that's concerned, fine. Your growth is 2.5 trillion. So if you look at the ratio between what you're losing, and this is losing in the first order, these are direct losses, these are not indirect losses. This does not take into account losses for nature and agriculture and things like that, which we don't know how to measure, or biodiversity we don't know how to measure. Those are quite significant. So your incremental growth is 2.5 trillion. You're losing a trillion or more at the current point of time when we know the climate is coming. That's to give you a sense of scale of where we are. But the more important number in some senses for a lot of the discussions we've been having here is the actual size of the exposure in the global economy. So, $100 trillion economy actually has exposure, if you add buildings and infrastructure, if I remember the number correctly, about 550 trillion, fine? Of which 2/3 is buildings and 1/3 is infrastructure. So I think the immediate question that hits you, not in terms of the large number itself, is in your information systems, how much of buildings and how much of infrastructure you want to put in there. So some countries will want to focus on infrastructure because that's their core challenge. Others will want to focus on buildings. But in actual fact, whether you're an OECD country or not, especially with climate coming in and dealing with all kinds of other questions, you have retrofit issues in buildings. In other parts of the world, you're building lots of new buildings. So I think the core question is, how do you build these information systems to address both? If you have resource limitations, which one do you pick first, depending on what your economic priorities are and what the implications are for, on life, on livelihoods, on economic output, and a whole range of other processes down the line. So I think that's the thing that we have to get somewhat clear. So like I said, $100 trillion of output, $550 trillion worth of assets at risk, of which about, infrastructure is about 175 odd, maybe 200, depending on how you count it. The rest of it is buildings. And the buildings are of various shapes and sizes. Now, if you just look at that, at those numbers themselves, fine, just to give you a sense of scale, at the global scale. And the reason I'm saying this here is, we know the G20 is 80% of global output, fine. 2/3 of people, 80% of output. So effectively what happens in this room determines how the global economy is going to work, how we address risk at global scale, how we mobilize markets, structure public and private investment to make this happen. This is really, it's a big question which will make a difference, for the rest of the world as far as that's concerned. So in that, I think there are 2 or 3 things that are important. The first thing, like I said, is 1/3 infrastructure, 2/3 buildings. How do you bring them together? Because especially given the world that it is, we now have a world which is 55% urban, going to become even more, fine? 80% of economic output comes from urban areas. So what do we have? We have a risk environment that is global now, fine? We know about that, especially for hydromet risk, for seismic tectonic or, for geohydrological, meteorological risks are sort of across the whole landscape as far as that's concerned. So in that, if you look again at the exposure, 1/3 is geohazards and about 2/3 is climate, okay? And as far as we know it, of course, I'm not talking about exposure now, I'm just looking at the hazard risk side, fine? As far as we know it, the geohazards is not going to grow dramatically, fine, in terms of hazard risk. But the hydromet is going to grow very rapidly as we go from 1.1 to 1.5 to 2, and if we get to where Paris is, we're at 2.7 to 3.2. So just in terms of the risk exposure on the hazard side, cyclonic storms, sea level rise in the long run, drought, flooding, etc., all the, the nasty things that come with too much water, too little water, and polluted water as far as that's concerned, we're going to see an expansion of the hazard risk side. So when we're thinking ahead, depending on where we are, if you're a littoral country or you're looking at something like Mumbai on the seacoast or you're inland and you have drought, you have to be relatively clear about how this thing is going to play itself out. That's, I guess, the second thing that I'm trying to say. So look at the exposure, fine, and then try and see where the hazards are actually playing themselves out and how they will change over time. And the big numbers, of course, are interesting, but it gives you a sense of relative scale. And of course, in large countries, whether it's Brazil or South Africa or the United States or the European Union or India, you'll have tremendous diversity because, geological context changes, hydrological context changes, etc. Those become fairly important as far as that's concerned. So given that breakup, 1/3 infrastructure, 2/3 buildings, 1/3 geohazards, 2/3 climate, how would you structure a system that would start responding to these things? Because the investment is going to come, fine, or it should come. And there, I guess, 3 things that are there. One is the current stock and how you deal with that. So let's say in the global north, the questions are often of retrofit, whether it's to reduce hazards to earthquakes like in California or pretty much or in Japan for that matter. In other places, it's a question of how you building new build infrastructure. But in between that, because we're in an urbanizing planet, the issue is how do you structure your urban areas, fine? And in that, how you plan, how you organize things in space, in which both land and infrastructure markets are very, very critical. The speciality of that is quite important. And we know in that context that at the current point of time, if we have across the world to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, we have a significant infrastructure gap. And that infrastructure gap, depending on how you count it, is in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year just to deal with meeting the outcomes of the goals. On top of that, you add risk, which is coming to you from geohazards, kind of known, and the global models will show us that, and increasing risk that will come to us because of climate. And climate hazards becoming even more intense. And you'll see the geographies of that will change, especially with climate change. So it's a question of how you deal with what you have just now, how you deal with what you should be having, because you're in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia or other parts of Asia, and effectively you're bringing hundreds of millions of people into cities and other places, and you concentrate risk in some senses. So how do you deal with that? And then finally, because infrastructure ages, and it ages quite quickly, even if you built it up relatively quickly like China is, how do you deal with the problem of aging infrastructure as it goes out of its life cycle, especially because when you're building very quickly, you do not build in a very resilient manner. You don't have the investment, you don't have the standards, and there's no political push to make that happen. So that's, I guess, one of the core questions that we have. You have to design an information system or a data system or a modeling system that not only takes into account what has been there in the past, but how these trends will change in the future. Obviously, I'm making very, very broad generalizations here. Any economist in the room would say, what the hell are you talking about? But I'm just trying to give you the big picture of how we have to think about these questions, because technically we know how to do this stuff. It's been done before. It's not a big issue as far as that's concerned. So there's the question of the investment gap to deal with the delivery of services and places to live and places to work. fine? And there's a question of how much incremental investment will require to make it more resilient, fine? That's just the service side. Now, having said that, I'll step back even one step even wider than that and say, look, we have three sort of what I would call a trichotomy in the risk space, which we need to grapple with in trying to define and address these questions in terms of risk, fine? Because the numbers are big. These are trillion-dollar problems. The investments are also of the order of tens of trillions of dollars because your savings rates are that much, and this in a sense drives growth, drives employment. We know that post-COVID, etc. The first thing is the hazard risk landscape is spread across the world, fine? It's diffused. And especially as we're getting into more hydromet-led hazards, it's going to be even more diffused. We wouldn't think there were huge problems in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, and high-altitude areas earlier, but now these are going to become, basically the risk landscape is going to be extremely diffused and be across the world as far as that's concerned, fine? Which means that we need to have very good geographic information of how risks is spread across the landscape. And I think that's where the partnership across countries in G20 is very important. Most of us, I think between the countries here, you have most of the satellite assets across the world because we can measure things that we never knew that was possible to measure in the past. You can even measure at the moment how much groundwater declines. You can do lots of things. And, I model. So in July, we're having a summit in Berlin, which is looking at exoscale models. So instead of doing stuff at 50 by 50 kilometer scale, because of the computing abilities we have, we're going down to 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer on the climate side, which means suddenly the disaster risk models and the climate models can meet somewhere in between, fine? So the risk landscape is going to be spread across the world, fine? And with climate, at least in the first order, you have to have information, I would say, ideally at the 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer scale, and we have the technologies and methods to do it not only from satellites, but potentially now with digital technology on the ground, because sensor costs are becoming much lower. The second thing, which is quite important to pick up on the climate story, is we're going to have to capture carbon, fine? And the capturing of carbon by growing forests or doing something under the ground, etc., is going to be a significant part of the impact as far as vulnerability is concerned across the world, especially in environments where water is scarce, land is scarce, and there are a lot of people. So there's a new emergent second-order set of risks that are going to come for our attempt to try and deal with climate. Some of them may be maladaptive or not, that we have to think about, because if we don't think about them, we won't measure them. If we don't measure them, we won't be able to integrate them into the frameworks. So come back to that point. Basically, hazard risk is going to spread across the landscape. But on the other hand, risk is becoming increasingly more concentrated, pretty obviously, because we're becoming more urbanized. Basically, the risk is where the people are. People are typically along coasts, in littoral areas where the water is, and around cities. So risk, the rest of the risk, especially the exposure and vulnerability, is becoming more concentrated. So that means that the models that you have, the information systems, have to cope with a diffused hazard risk landscape, but a higher concentration of vulnerability and exposure at the same time, which means you have to work across the settlement systems, across the economic systems, across the network infrastructures to understand the third thing which has started emerging. We all know that from COVID. We know that from all the work that's been done in UNDR, et cetera, across the world. And that is, we are really experiencing systemic risk, right? Systemic risk happens when different elements of the system, risk is cascading or compounding through that system that's there, right? And how does this systemic risk appear in economic systems? It appears in the multiplier impacts of a direct loss. So you have a flood somewhere. It might be in Pakistan. It might be in Thailand. So many examples of it, of Fukushima. And what you have locally is not what you get at the national level. So we're dealing with three things at the same time. A risk landscape that is becoming much more diverse. We have good technologies to understand that, but we have to collaborate because there are multi-hazard risks. I mean, there are multiple hazards that are there at the same time. You have to know what the frequencies are like. You have to be able to sort of model them and whatever. The vulnerability is very critical for many of our countries, including, I would say, for countries in the global north, because service levels and infrastructure levels have declined very significantly. Whether you see, the sort of recovery, the sort of infrastructure program in the US or what's happening in Europe, especially as you're trying to do a just transition and the other infrastructures at the other time. And the key question then in the larger risk framework is, how do you reduce systemic risks by reducing the impact multiplier that is there? So if your risk is of the order of $1 trillion, the impact multiplier, as we estimating just now, maybe twice that size. So then you're losing 2 trillion of 2.5 trillion of growth. We don't actually know those numbers, but it's important for us to build the models to be able to understand whether it is. Because that is the rationale for actually working on questions of governance, risk governance, financing, etc., because that's the multiplier impact that you see across the economy or across sectors in some sense. So what are the responses? And I'll close very quickly with this. The response, of course, is to build resilient infrastructure, right? That's one response. And we have a fairly good idea about that. There are global standards and many things like telecom and power systems, et cetera, et cetera. But typically, resilient infrastructures work along one sector or one set of economic activities. I mean, there's a sector, and you're able to reduce the risk for that sector as far as that's concerned. There again, we have to be careful about the mix of what happens in terms of output loss, because that's a very significant thing in a growing economy, or especially newly developing economy. Capital raisement cost, and of course, something that we often forget, and that is the asset life. So when I'm coming back to where the model should be like, where the data system should be like, if you don't have an understanding of, first, where the people are, second, where the economic activity is actually happening, third, where your assets are that actually enable the economic activity and the output and the services where they are in a geographical manner, you can't address the connection between vulnerability exposure and the hazard risk which is changing. That's absolutely critical. So the question is, how can we economically do this at the lowest possible scale? We know that all the fiduciary models do this, but they're only available for certain geographies. How can we expand that process in a public data frame for the rest of the world is one question. But that's only looking at the question of resilient infrastructure. The larger question, which is more difficult and we don't have good answers to, is if you're talking about building infrastructure for resilience, as different from resilient infrastructure, infrastructure to enable social development, human development, nature-based solutions, and protecting nature and macroeconomic stability, we have to understand the linkages between the sector and those infrastructures, which means that as a community that works on risk, or the fiduciary aspect of risk, we have to talk to the people who are working the economic side and the people who are working the finance side. Because the investments are not going to flow, or let's say the investments go to places where you have the best multiplier gains that you have, whether it's in terms of output or in terms of job creation or otherwise. And we don't have the frameworks for that. And frankly, because I work across this in different parts of the world, we don't actually have the right people in conversation. We now have some of the finance community in conversation with the risk community, intermediated by people in insurance, but we don't have the macroeconomists and the finance community and the risk community talking to each other, because it's only when you're bringing the macroeconomists inside, the central banks and finance ministries, et cetera, that you'll be able to look at the connection between different forms of risk, different forms of infrastructure, and the synergies, and in some cases, serious trade-offs that you have. So what I'm saying is, we need to build what we have. We've had most of the stuff in place. We have to do that systematically, because unless we're able to get risk information, we can't pool risk. If you can't pool risk, we can't finance it, either from the national scale or using various forms of capital, whether DFI capital or otherwise. And at the other end, if you're not able to get risk at a fine-grained enough kind of frame, you can't address it from the community, from the local inside, whether it's early warning or response or rebuilding, et cetera. So we need fine-grained models, but there's obviously a trade-off between trying to do everything and doing what is possible in the time that we have. So prioritization is critical, fine, but we have to have a framework that addresses each of these questions in very simple, straightforward terms, starting with how much output we have, how much investment actually goes in, where the risk is situated, how it's partitioned between buildings and infrastructure, how it's partitioned between geohazards and climate, how much of it is vulnerability-led, which is a lot of the global south, how much of it is exposure-led, which is things that you may or may not be able to do something about, and then hazard modification is something that becomes extremely expensive. We know that from the climate side. I think in other sides also, even to do hazard modification on geohazards is very expensive. So we have a clear idea of what kind of interventions are possible and can be dealt with. So I'll stop there. I hope I didn't kind of sort of overstate my case, but I'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aroma Ravi, for the wonderful talk and for unbundling the complexity and also highlighting the multiplier impact and the need for the geoinformation. Without further ado, I think I'll invite the next panel, moderated by Professor Satoru Nishikawa. So while I invite the panelists, I'll also introduce them. Professor Satoru Nishikawa-san has held various positions in Japanese government, UN, Tokyo Metropolitan Government, and Asian Disaster Reduction Center. At the wake of the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, he also coordinated the Japanese government technical assistance in the affected countries. He is the lead author of the International Science Council Policy Brief, and he's currently the professor at Nagoya University Disaster Mitigation Center, and he's starting April 2023. Recently, he joined JICA and Tohoku University. Professor Satoru Nishikawa-san, please, I welcome you to the stage. We also have two speakers joining us online and one speaker joining us in person. So first I would like to invite Mr. Brendan Moon, Coordinator General, National Emergency Management Agency, Australia. And do we have him online? So, Mr. Brendan Moon is the Australia's first Coordinator General for the National Emergency Management Agency, where he is leading the delivery of national programs that reduces disaster risk and also limit the impacts of the disaster on communities and economies. And earlier to his current responsibility, he was with the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, where he led the operation for Tropical Cyclone Oswald and Marcia, and the statewide reconstruction and recovery efforts from all significant natural disaster. We also have with us Dr. Durga Rao, and he's the Group Director, Disaster Management Support Program, National Remote Sensing Agency, India. And Dr. Durga Rao is part of the Indian Space Research Organization, so please. And he's a fellow of the Indian Water Resource Society and Indian Association of Hydrologists. As director of NRSC, he's also responsible for space-based disaster management support activities in the country in risk preparedness during and post-disaster management. We also have with us Mr. Mark Harvey, Head of Profession, Infrastructure and Urban at Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, United Kingdom. Mr. Mark Harvey, he has over 30 years of experience in the analysis, design, and implementation of policy and country strategies and program of UK international development in India, Southern Africa, Nepal, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and Vietnam. Acknowledging his contribution, he was also conferred with the Order of British Empire in 2011. Welcome, Mr. Mark. Over to you, Professor Nishikawa.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for joining our side event. Now, this afternoon, I'm not dancing, but I'll be moderating this session. This session is about how risk information or risk assessment can induce good action, better action by various actors, including the government, private sector, or the households. So we have one panelist here with us and two online panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to first invite Mr. Brendan Moon from Australia for his inputs to our side event. So the floor is yours, Mr. Moon. I think he's online already. Oh, here he is. So please go ahead. Oh. So, Mr. Brendan Moon, you are invited to make your presentation. Oh, okay. Mr. Moon, I think you are muted. Can you hear me? Mr. Moon, please go ahead. If that is the case, may I invite Dr. Rao for his presentation first? Can you change the order of the presentation? Can you have the slides of Dr. Rao on screen?
Good afternoon to all delegates. I would like to brief on role of space technology in disaster risk management, in specific to infrastructure risk management. What is the role of Indian Space Research Organization in disaster risk management in the country in addressing that Prime Minister's 10-point agenda? Next slide, please. I can use this. Indian Space Research Organization has established a center at National Remote Sensing Center to provide space-based and aerial-based information addressing all natural disasters in all phases of the disasters. Particularly, we work on floods, cyclones in response phase, in mitigation phase, in early warning phase, and we work on landslide damage assessment, landslide hazard assessment, landslide forecasting, and forest fire alert system, and we have national database for emergency management, and we have international cooperation through Sentinel Asia and UNESCAP and International Charter, and we work on some disasters in the transboundary areas also. Coming to the response phase. So what we do using in remote sensing data, addressing mainly floods and cyclones, in the event of, we have automated disaster watch mechanism. In the event of any disaster, we acquire immediately our Indian remote sensing satellite data. In absence of that, we look for Sentinel data or Landsat data. Even sometimes we procure RadarSat data also. If it is a major disaster, we activate International Charter and Sentinel Asia, and we get data from foreign space missions. And we prepare a flood map immediately using microwave remote sensing data, because it has a capability of penetrating through the clouds, and we integrate with the geospatial data like rails, road network, and village level information, and prepare statistics at village, at district level, and disseminate to the user organization at within 3 to 4 hours turnaround time. So in case of infrastructure damage assessment, we depend on very high resolution optical remote sensing data, which is of 0.5 meter resolution, and we take pre-image, pre-flood image, and post-flood image, and we analyze. Here you can see in middle image. Last year there was a flood in Godavari River, Polavaram project. A dam was under construction. Complete dam site was inundated. You can see the pre-flood, and during flood, the complete construction area was affected by the flood. So in case of cyclones particularly, there won't be much flooding, but the damage due to the wind will be very high. So we do the damage assessment using, again, optical high resolution satellite images. Buildings got affected by the buildings affected, roads, railway network affected by the cyclones, etc. You can see one of the right image in Odisha in 2019 cyclone. And there was a major flood disaster in 2021 in Rishiganga River, where Tapovan project got affected due to flash flood in Rishiganga River. So we continuously monitored using high resolution optical data. You can see here that Tapovan, the bottommost right side picture, Tapovan project completely inundated due to the flood, and a lot of sedimentation took place in the site. So this information we provide within turnaround time of 3 to 4 hours to all the user organizations like MHA, NDMA, SDMAs, state disaster management organizations, and concerned disaster management officials. Next, please. So, similarly, in the event of landslides, we do the damage assessment again using high resolution optical satellite data. You can see here one in Assam, roads affected by the landslides. And the top corner, you can see the another high resolution optical image. I think Jiffy is not playing. Pre and post event of the, again, Rishiganga flood, major bridges got washed off because of the flash flood, and roads were affected. Apart from the flood maps and damage assessment, we do the other value-added products like flood cumulative maps, means if there is a long period flooding, or 10 days or 2 weeks flooding. So since we wanted on daily basis, we prepare a cumulative flood map so that each village you will be knowing for how many days it is under flooding. So that is a vital information for damage assessment. And on need basis, we do the damage assessment for agriculture crop damage assessment also we do. So that information also we provide in near real time. Next, please. Next slide, please. So coming to the mitigation phase, having the advantage of more than 20 years satellite data, recently we prepared National Flood Affected Area Atlas using 25 years satellite images, 1998 to 2022, and got released in March month only during third year at Delhi. And along with that, we prepared state level flood hazard atlas also for the most 6 flood prone states in the country, because this flood hazard atlas is one of the best non-structural method for flood damage mitigation, and it is useful for controlling the developmental activities, and it is useful for planning relief and rescue shelters and health shelters also. It is useful for growing the tolerant crops, giving idea for growing the tolerant crops, and it is useful for the reservoir operations also. Okay, so here you will have different classes like very low hazard, medium hazard, and very high hazard. Total 5 classes are given at state level. Next, please. And addressing flash floods is a very big challenging task particularly. Many times it is difficult to capture satellite images in the event of flash floods because of very less lead time. Maybe sometimes less than 12 hours also. So if some satellite pass is there, we can capture it. Otherwise, we have to do some inundation simulation modeling only. But we got some requests from Indian Railways a few years back because in India, about 70,000 rail bridges, small to big rail bridges, about 70,000 bridges are older than 90 years and vulnerable to the floods. There was a big disaster in the Madhya Pradesh, Machik River flash flood. More than 25 people were killed that time because of flash flood, and bridge got collapsed. Okay. So train got derailed, many people were killed. So that time we got a request from Minister of Railways to prepare a flood vulnerability map for the country so that they can know where are the railway bridges in the high vulnerable zones. So what we did, because it is a flash flood is something different. Sometimes it may not be in the major floodplains also. It is due to very high intensity rainfall, sometimes it will happen. So using 100 years daily rainfall data, we analyzed, we computed the probable maximum precipitation, we computed daily runoff for all the 100 years, we computed probable maximum runoff and topographic slopes, land use, land cover, drainage density, and water bodies at pan-India level. We integrated in the multi-criteria evaluation technique. We prepared a flood hazard, flood vulnerability index, flash flood vulnerability index for the complete country. You can see here below, first image is flash flood vulnerability index, second image all rail bridges that are falling on very high vulnerable zones. So at the same time, we are giving pan-India level runoff also. So when there is a runoff of more than 100 mm magnitude, and if your railway bridge is falling on the high vulnerable zones, then the ministry has to pay attention, concerned engineers has to pay attention on the particular railway bridges. In view of that, this system is developed. Next, please. And another is a spatial flood early warning system. Generally, satellite images will provide you the near real-time information only, after the event only. But for an effective disaster damage mitigation, we need a flood early warning system so that it will give information 2 days in advance. And here, we work on spatial flood early warning, not only the flood forecast, so we should be able to simulate the possible areas to be, that will be affected by the flood 2 days in advance. Okay, so that we will be knowing what village at what time it will be affected by the flood, and what will be the magnitude of the flood, what will be the depth of flooding, what will be the velocity of flooding. Depth and velocity of flooding information you will not get from the satellite images. That will be possible through inundation simulation modeling only. So we have done under National Hydrology Project, we have done 2 projects for Godavari and Tapi rivers, and for the last 3 years we are running operationally, and we are providing flood alerts with more than 87% accuracy to the concerned state government organizations. Left side you can see inundation simulation with depth information. Right side you can see villages that are affected. What is how much area is affected, what is the depth, velocity, etc. Next, please. And finally, the complete information, whatever we do, floods, cyclones, forest fire, landslides, earthquakes, whatever it is. So we have a national level geo portal that disseminates our space-based products along with the services from the forecasting organizations like IMD, CWC, MOSDEC, and Geological Survey of India, etc. So here the main aim is, we have developed this latest version, released recently only, All India disaster scenario map you can see on the portal. So particularly if you once you open it on that day, particular day, what are the disasters in India? That information you will know, either forest fire or flood or cyclone, whatever it may be. And once you click that particular, then it will go to the next tab. If it is a flood, it will show the flood map. If it is a forecast related, it will show the forecast. If it is a landslide, it will go to the landslide portal. So it is completely theme-based portal, like hydrological disasters, means floods, cyclones, and CWC services, our space services, everything are there. Geological services, if you look at, you will have landslides, earthquake, etc. Similarly, meteorological services you have, okay? So everything is there, because now this will become a disaster recovery site for the forthcoming ICRER, Integrated Control Room at Emergency Response at MHCA. So in view of that, we developed this portal addressing to disseminate all disaster specific information, either space-based information or information from the all disaster services provided organizations. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very informative presentation on how rich we have regarding various risk information in India. Now, can we have the presentation from Mr. Moon from Australia online?
Thank you, Professor Nishikawa. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. So, can we have his screen on? His slides? Okay, we have it. So, Mr. Moon, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, and colleagues, apologies for the earlier connection problems, and I will rely on the technical team to be able to scroll through my presentation when I ask them to forward. What I'd like to do this evening very much take into account the previous comments about the importance of using data and different delivery mechanisms to actually empower all levels of government and all levels of the community to take proactive steps. Most recently, after the flood experience here in Australia, it is once again underlined the importance of that close connection with all levels of government so that we can effect not only recovery, but more resilient outcomes into the future. To give you a snapshot of what we've experienced here in Australia, we've only just emerged from our third consecutive La Nina event. When you recognise the size of Australia, there are some 500 local government areas. 4 out of 5 of all of those local government areas have been impacted by flooding in the past 3 years. many of them multiple times. And I know this has been experienced across the globe and it is not particularly an issue in the Australian context. However, when we start to look at the size of the road networks that have been impacted by those events, the true scale of the flooding and the challenges that we face globally and how we actually deal with not only historical risk, but the future risk starts to put it into context that we need to change the way we use data and that we need to change the way we finance and make decisions and prioritise vulnerable pieces of infrastructure. Our road network for local government is some 700,000 kilometres in length. 500,000 kilometres of that road network is unsealed and particularly vulnerable to the flooding events that we have experienced. In the last 3 years, we've seen large-scale losses of homes, businesses, and massive dislocation caused by the destruction of infrastructure. Our challenge has been, how do we best equip our delivery partners to confidently prioritise the rebuild and make more resilient the vulnerable sections of our infrastructure network? How do we use this incorporating impact data, risk and vulnerability data, and the latest engineering techniques in an environment with limited technical capacity, constrained finance options, and also community expectation placing a lot of pressure on delivery organisations to rebuild quickly after an event. Firstly, if I can go to my second slide, which is talking about the Queensland Betterment Fund, and this is the investment vehicle. If you go up one further, please. Back to the start, please, gentlemen. Thank you. Okay, I'll talk to the Queensland Betterment Fund is the investment vehicle that we have used, which is essentially 3 levels of government coming together to fund not only recovery but more resilient outcomes in infrastructure for local government and also for state governments. They're all co-funded, co-contributed, and the challenge has really been is starting to quantify what are the benefits of this particular funding model. And this Betterment Fund has been in place now for 10 years with over 500 projects delivered under it, $140 million investment, saving all levels of government approximately $400 million in reconstruction costs. But what is important are some of those non-tangible costs, and that is that if we look at all of those assets that have actually been vetted or investment in more resilient outcomes, 80% have been functional or non-damaged in the immediate aftermath of the many events that have occurred since, thereby keeping those communities that previously will have been disconnected as a result of flooding, keeping them connected and also functional in the immediate aftermath of an event. Next slide, please, gentlemen. What we've done to actually assist in terms of developing a decision-making tool to actually assist all levels of government has been the Repeat Events and Dollars Index, what we call the READY Index. And this is a combined index that measures the recurrent impact and expenditure on a scale from 0 to 100 for disaster events. Because what we were experiencing was that repeated events, we were seeing many pieces of infrastructure being re-damaged and us having to reconstruct event after event, year after year, and many times in one particular year. And it is calculated by collecting the number of climate events that have impacted that location, also the cost to actually reconstruct that particular asset, and also we then combine it to provide a combined index, which is essentially the events density and the dollars density to give a weighted sum, and thereby a high value of the READY Index can occur where a location has been impacted by many events and is very expensive to repair. We've pulled that together in a web context using GIS tools and essentially have provided a heat map for all of the local governments in one particular state in Australia. This allows us then to prioritise investment based on historical risk, and if we start to use data sets imported in terms of what climate risk looks like into the future. It allows us to prioritise our investments into the future so that we can start to ensure that our infrastructure in the face of climate change is less vulnerable. And this is available to all levels of government, all the way down to the to very, very small councils, and it is an essential tool, especially when you recognise the availability of that technical know-how at a local level is somewhat constrained. This is the type of tool which assists in that. If I could go to the next event, please, next slide, please. To give you an example of what this looks like, and now this tool actually applies to major complex infrastructure projects, but also all the way down to gravel roads and gravel road solutions. And you've obviously got in front of you there a photo of the Arakoon Access Road, which joins a First Nations community on the Cape of York. And it is an essential connection for that community for health, employment, education and training. And the reality is when this particular piece of road was cut multiple times, the price of fuel, the price of essential foodstuffs essentially doubled for that particular community. So a betterment solution was not just about saving costs of reconstruction, but it was also essential in the ongoing operation of that community. That particular restoration event for the investment of $3 million, $3.1 million up front essentially saved over $8 million in the long term. Next slide, please. In terms of the data sets that we are now using to inform the READY Index, we are using a whole range of data sets. This has just grown from impact assessments. We are now importing some of the risk work being done, the updated flood modelling, to start to overlay that on the original damage data assessment tools, so that we're now starting to build a more complete picture of what historical risk looks like, what future risk looks like, and what the vulnerabilities are for key pieces of infrastructure, with end users being local government and communities, but also universities and engineers, because with each of those data points and each of those data sets, we actually collect the restoration treatments and the cost of delivering those, so that we have a massive data set for a complete state and a complete transport system that will inform investment now and also into the future. Next slide, thank you. Some of the challenges that we have faced during this, and is obviously something which will be ubiquitous across all the areas in which you and I work in, creating that consistent data set and approach up front. And then also, how do we make this accessible and also easily import new sets of data? These have been some of our challenges, but working with all our stakeholders, we have got some quite considerable success in terms of that final tool, which is a very, very effective medium to actually display where the hotspots are, where people can start to prioritise investment into the future. And also, it informs maintenance programs for many of these local governments. Next slide, please. Our next challenge at a national level is how do we roll this out across the nation? And obviously, some of the key steps that we must now need to take is ensuring that we have the governance arrangements in place for a country that has 6 states and 2 territories. So it's about bringing all those actors to the table and recognising that now is the time for decision making for long-term benefit into the future. We are not going to be able to flood-proof much of our infrastructure network, but what we can do now is look particularly at those vulnerable points, those points that make a community vulnerable, make our supply chains vulnerable, and this is an important part of our strategy. It's establishing a consistent approach nationwide, and importantly, it's about designing a range of investment products, not only for the technology, but also for the infrastructure solution into the future. And once again, it's also about improving that understanding of resilient investment amongst all sectors, not just the recovery and emergency management space, not just infrastructure owners, but this will be a whole of society solution. Professor Nishikawa, I'll leave my presentation there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moon, for your very extensive explanations, and I really appreciate your emphasis that these information enable resilient investment for infrastructures. Thank you. Now I'd like to invite our next online speaker from UK, Mr. Mark Harvey. Is he online with us?
Yes, he is.
Okay, so can we have his slides on the screen?
Sure. Well, I hope so.
So please go ahead.
Great, thank you. Can people hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Having been at the ICDRI event in Delhi a month ago, I can picture what you're doing on the stage there, faced with an audience and dealing with people coming online from around the world. It's a huge challenge. So, but good morning from the UK, which is just still morning, and good afternoon to all of you in Mumbai. I know it's changed a lot since I lived there in the early 1990s. So I wish I could be with you in person, but that's not possible. So I've been asked to present a case study from the UK, which is always a bit of a tricky problem. I work for the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, used to be with Department for International Development. So although I sit in the UK, and I'm presenting a project from the UK, actually my focus and the focus of my colleagues and colleagues I work with who are sitting in the audience is generally outside the UK. So I offer this as an example of something that has been done in the UK. It was suggested to me by Mark McDonald's, a colleague who was with us in Delhi last month. And it's featured quite strongly in the UK Institution of Civil Engineers as a good response to climate change. But also at the end, I will touch on a relevant project that the UK FCDO has been supporting for a few years with the World Bank in Tanzania, because there is relevance in that. So I wish I had perhaps put a few photos in the slides. Apologies for the numbers of words. We're really talking about a project, an engineering project for flood management, tidal flood management. So I'll pick up on just something that Aramar Revi, I apologize for the facilitator for this session, I didn't catch your name, but I did catch the end of Aramar's session just at the beginning where he talked about, is it infrastructure for resilience or is it resilient infrastructure? Good question, because we're really looking at a project here that is hopefully resilient infrastructure for resilient outcomes. But we could debate that terminology and that description until the cows come home. So this project is it's part of the UK's National Infrastructure Pipeline. It's one of the biggest civil engineering projects the town has seen in Boston, in Lincolnshire. And it was funded through a £100 million flood defence grant. And it now is invested to better protect over 14,000 properties from tidal flooding. So it's one of the best standards of tidal flood defence outside of London. The Thames Barrier in London will be quite well known by everybody, and this is the next one along the list. It responded to the impact of a natural disaster in 2013, and that disaster was assessed, and this project came about, and it's transformed the entire community. The report that was featured in the Civil Engineering Institution's proceedings focused in particular how the Sustainable Development Goals were used to recognise that there were broader societal outcomes from this project. And set in the context that the winter floods in the UK that year cost £1.6 billion. The scheme cost 120, but this scheme, net present value estimate is 1.1 billion. So there's the economic benefit comes through that. Next slide, please. In following the sort of guidance from the conference organisers of how the risk information helped in better planning and design. Well, fundamentally, it was the technical assessment of risk was those first 3 or 4 bullet points was climate change globally, IPCC, the UK Meteorological Office, increased granularity, and localization of those global trends. And then the UK Environment Agency, who I would have liked to have bring in to help with this presentation. Policies and standards have been adopted from that. And the extreme tidal flood event protection is estimated to be a 1 in 300 year return period. So the risk information was there. There was also drawing on local historical records. There have been 9 major events that people in the region can talk about, know of from their family histories. In the last 200 years, 9 major events. It was the December 2013 that really triggered the response in this one. And as a result, that came into the Boston Barrier became a national priority project in 2014, which then secured the funding. So those first 3 bullet points on there are really the technical assessments of risks. The secondary risk information, I called it secondary risk information, came from the Association of British Insurers, which looked at property risk impact, Lincolnshire County Council and the Boston Borough Council, District Council, local and regional social and economic risks and impact, national government, Department of Communities and Local Government looked at local economic activity, the risk to that. Already mentioned the local community groups. And the National Health Service were brought in as well, the risks to their sustaining of the National Health Service as an employer and a service provider. That was also part of the risk assessment. So the risk information is there, the benefits are there, factual, personal and public and economic. So I'd say there's the technical assessment of risk and there's the political assessment of risk to make the case for the project. And I assume, that the Environment Agency are ranking these various risks at a national level, but I'm not particularly involved in that. If we can move on to the next slide, we've got those information providers and users, wide range, homeowners, businesses, service providers, emergency service providers, the UK Met Office, the UK Environment Agency, local community groups, and local government at the county level and the Boston. I think one message that's come through talking to the Environment Agency very briefly about this is how they now use the SDGs as their organising framework for all their projects nationally. Next slide, on to the challenges that were faced. I think really we can probably skip through this. The case study I've drawn on was largely about an engineering project. And so the sort of risk assessment that was the sort of risks that emerged through any major infrastructure project. And yet there were also risks during delivery, which I suppose has some relevance in that looking at the delivery of the primary barrier gate came by ship. So there would have been operational risks and real-time risks from weather and tides during that engineering operation. So the usual construction risks. What would inform this meeting better would be the operational risks of how that tidal barrier is now in service. So moving on to the last slide, if you could, using this event within FCDO, I'm keen with colleagues to take this disaster resilience risk reduction approach into other programs. We do have work with the Tanzania Urban Resilience Program, working with the World Bank in Tanzania, and there are others around. So this will be, I hope, a contribution to the compendium of best practice examples that the group are putting together to go into the compendium later this year. Look forward to joining the discussion. There's a flavour of one successful resilient infrastructure project for resilient outcomes. Back to you guys. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Harvey. A very extensive explanation. Now, let me turn to a set of materials that I have prepared. So can we have my slides? Now, I'm going to introduce how in Japan we are using the risk information that is already available. And we have, since Japan is situated in a very earthquake active zone, I'm going to provide you with two examples. One is regarding seismic risk. In Japan, the National Research Institute for Earth Sciences and Disaster Resilience, they have now issued or published this probabilistic earthquake vibration prediction map. And it covers the entire Japanese archipelago with, in consideration of the major ocean tectonic earthquakes around the Japanese archipelago and also the active faults in Japan. Now, with all of these, I'll say, probabilistic calculations, here is the map. Now, and it is accessible through the portal site of the NIED, the research institution. Now, there are so many ways to utilize this very valuable information. Next slide, please. And if you enlarge this map, this is the upper map is the map around the Tsuruga city in the Japan seaside of Japan. The below map, mostly red, is Nagoya, where I was working till March. So there's a big difference among the geographical areas in Japan. Now, how can we utilize these maps? Next slide, please. Now, there are so many ways to use this map. And this is one case of a contingency planning and exercises led by the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport and Tourism, Hokuriku Bureau, Port and Transport Section. Now, their concern is that if there is to be a major earthquake on the Pacific side of Japan, the ports of the facing the Pacific would not be able to use for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And during that time, how can Japan survive without import exports? So we need a contingency plan. If there is to be an ocean tectonic earthquake on the Pacific side, it would not affect the Japan seaside. And in Japan, we have so many ports in the Japan seaside. By showing the previous map to the potential users of the ports, maybe the manufacturing companies or the wholesale or retail companies, they can persuade these companies to join in a simulation exercise for contingency planning. Then they would call on these companies to join in the exercise drill so that they can be better prepared for a future event. And if they can check the procedures for contingency planning, that would lead to better preparedness. So that is one case. This is led by the government with involvement of so many private companies and forwarders and transport companies. Okay, the next slide, please. This is about changing the action by households. In Japan, now all the municipalities are obliged to issue flood hazard maps. And all of these municipalities, in Japan we have approximately 1,800 municipalities. Now they have all published their flood hazard maps. And they are collected in the Geospatial Information Authority of Japan website. And there's one portal site which gives access to all the flood maps in Japan. So that's the top screen of that portal site. Now, next slide, please. And if you click and indicate one municipality that you would like to see, the flood hazard maps appear on the screen. This is an example of a flood hazard map of Kamaishi city in the northern part of Japan. And now everybody can have easy access to these flood hazard maps. Now, with this enabling environment, it changes the real estate market. Next slide, please. Now, there's a new requirement of the real estate brokers to avoid inundation, new challenges for urban and land use control, and guiding action for households. Now, starting in 2020, all the real estate brokers must indicate to their potential customers that the piece of the real estate that you are going to either buy or rent is located in the flood map of this municipality, and your potential real estate may be inundated or not inundated. And it's free market in Japan for transactions of the real estate, but now by making it obligation that the real estate broker shows it on the map to the potential customer can really recognize what are the inundation possibility of that real estate. And then they can decide whether to rent or buy that real estate or not. And this is intended to really reduce the exposure to floods in the future. Previously, when the Japanese population was growing at a very high speed, there was no, I'll say, chances to think better about the risk of inundation. But now the population pressure is eased. Now we can provide better information for the customers that they choose according to the risk. Okay, next slide, please. Now, we're always saying that disaster risk reduction is to take action beforehand. Now, we can take better preventive action based on either past experiences or appreciation of risk. And if we can have the imagination of future disaster or tragedy. For example, what if your house is inundated? What if your school collapses? What if the hospital collapses? Or the bridge fall? Or what if the port is closed? And if we can recognize such risks in mind, we know that there's knowledge of effective ex-ante measures, and we can take action. So that's my presentation. So thank you for your attention. Now, maybe we have 1 or 2 minutes, and I'd like to pose a question to Dr. Rao. You have a very rich, database, and I'm asking you, what will be your next potential user of your rich information? Thank you.
Thank you. Generally, we provide our information to the state disaster management authorities, relief commissioners, and district level disaster management officials and revenue officials. And at national level, we provide information to the policy making organizations like NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority, Ministry of Home Affairs, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. And the time is
informed
limited, so
decision
this
and
is
action.
the end of my part of this session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Satoru Nishikawa, and thank you, Mr. Brendan Moon, and Dr. Durga Rao, and Mr. Mark Harvey. For our next session, we all know that there has been a significant technological advancement, which you saw in the last session, where people are using advanced mechanisms, including IoTs and satellite technology for collecting information. So while this information is being collected, it's very important to recognize the need for information sharing and also how this information is being used for building capacities and also for financing mechanism. For that, I invite the next panel and the moderator for the next panel, Mr. Amit Proti, who is the Director General for Coalition of Disaster Resilience Infrastructure, and he also has nearly 25 years of progressive leadership experience in the field of urban planning and resilient infrastructure in North America, Asia, and Europe. Also, I would like to invite the speakers onto the dais, Mr. Rowan Douglas, who's joining us online. And Mr. Rowan Douglas is the head of the Climate and Resilience Hub at Willis Towers and Watson, a leading global advisory and reinsurance company and chair of the Willis Research Network. And he was also conferred with Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2016 for services to economy through risk insurance and sustainable growth. Mr. Rowan Douglas will be joining us online. I would also like to invite Ms. Jinsun Lup, and she's at the Energy and Environmental Policy Analyst and leads the International Energy Agency's work on climate resilience and energy security. She's also working on assessing climate risk and impacts on energy system. Ms. Lim, please. I would also like to invite Professor Ravi Sinha, who is a professor and former dean at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay in India, and he is a civil and structural engineer and works mainly in earthquake engineering and disaster risk reduction. Professor Sinha, please welcome to the stage. I would also like to invite Ms. Namita Vikas. Ms. Namita Vikas is the founder and managing director of Actus ESG LLP. She's an award-winning senior business leader with over 30 years of diverse global experience, and she was also instrumental in raising over $1 billion in green capital from marquee global disaster financing institutions. Welcome onto the stage. Amit, over to you.
Thank you, Mahesh. I know it's late afternoon, and we've shown you a bunch of maps and interesting, colorful data, and I think I really appreciate how Dr. Nishikawa, Mark, Mr. Moon, and Dr. Durga actually helped just start to break apart all of the different ways data is being put together around the variety of hazards that exist. And of course, the way we had Aramar start giving us the big picture. We're looking, when we talk about data, it exists on so many levels, and it exists in so many contexts, in so many, when you think about flood issues, you think about heat waves emerging, when you think about the ice caps melting, all of that has data that can be used for decision making. But, unless we package that data, unless we are able to understand that data, unless we have people actually saying, what do I do with this data? I mean, yes, there's a lot of data, but what do we actually do about it? We don't make decisions. And so, in a way, this segment of the conversation is really about the users. And it's people who are actually saying, fantastic, we have data. Fantastic, we have this information. Now, what is it that we need to do about it? And we have, again, a variety of speakers today who will help us unpackage on the decision-making side how they're taking this information, how they've used it in the past, where are we going into the future? And that's the purpose of this part of the panel. Rowan, I'll start with you. And again, thank you for joining us virtually. But I always enjoy speaking with you. Rowan has already been introduced, but he's somebody who spent a lot of time in the insurance sector and beyond, but really starting to see how do you use data to reduce risk from an insurance side, but also for individuals. I think, Rowan, really, my question to you is how can insurance agencies, so you're representing the insurance agency, how can insurance agencies go beyond their conventional risk transfer mechanisms to empower individuals with a deeper understanding of risk? We heard Dr. Nishikawa just share an example from Japan where individuals were using information to make decisions. So coming back similarly to you on that individual focus, over to you.
Amit, thanks so much. Before I go further, can you hear me? If you can
Yes.
wave and let you know. Wonderful.
Clearly.
Okay, well, super. Well, it's so lovely to be with you, speaking from London. And in fact, it's a We've got an event at the Lord Mayor's house at Mansion House today in London. So it's climate and resilience everywhere. So it's so good to be with you. And I suppose the first thing I want to say is sort of to frame this, that insurance is sometimes seen in quite a narrow sense around sort of products and services and companies, but actually it's far more than that. Insurance is actually a way of governing societal risk and defining. If you want to manage risk, the first thing you have to decide is what is it you value, or what is it you're trying to protect, and that's not just homes and livelihoods. It's in many ways the very underpinnings of what creates a society and keeps us all together. So I think Australia, and it's been great to have a speaker from Queensland just before this session. I think Australia is the only country in the world where natural disaster related insurance for floods and earthquakes and other risks is still just about undertaken purely in the private sector. So the first thing to say is that in all countries, including of course India, where you are all today, the way that we share risk between societies, both through generations but also through space, is always a public-private partnership. We share risk through taxation or through insurance premiums, and usually societies find ways of sharing risk between those who have broader shoulders to bear, to support those who have not quite the same resources, but through often no fault of their own, are in the wrong place and in the wrong sort of facility. So that's the first thing. And most risk sharing up till now, with the exception of the international reinsurance market, has really been at a national level. But now we see through the UNFCCC process, things like loss and damage, and obviously the great work that's being done through CGRI, is to think how countries can actually share risk appropriately between each other so that we all can manage this global challenge. So that's sort of one framing. And then but in order to do that, we have to manage risk sustainably. And this draws me to this incredible challenge that we're all facing, but it's wonderful to see the progress in so many areas blossoming to create a garden of opportunity, is that we've got to translate the physics of physical climate into finance to help us make the right decisions and to help allocate capital correctly, but also to make sure that the risks that we're developing are not too great, and we're building the right sort of infrastructure, the right sort of homes, and we're giving people the information they need to make sensible decisions, including around finance. And the insurance sector around the world, it's been a little patchy, but around the world has had to go through the last 20 or 30 years of a journey from moving from relative ruin, when people were getting whacked through just using old claims files as the way of understanding risk, to developing a far more rigorous way of understanding the hazard, the exposed assets, and the vulnerability. And that's why we have to answer so many more questions these days when we buy insurance. But I suppose the point and we'll come on to the details, I know, of sort of the technicalities of risk modeling perhaps a little later on in the panel. But I suppose the point I want to get to is, in order to make risk sharing and insurance sustainable, I mean financially sustainable and affordable, we have to actually ultimately manage the risk within tolerable parameters. So so this is driving insurance-related organizations around the world to impose all sorts of new conditions to ultimately protect the communal capital pool that's ultimately underwriting these policies, but also ultimately to manage their own financial risk. But the pleasure is that that's actually ultimately then making society more resilient and ultimately protecting the basic rights of life, livelihood, and shelter. So I'll finish, Amit, because I know we're on time and we've got many great panelists to speak to. But just sort of here in the UK, for example, we had a challenge, rather smaller scale than India. We had a challenge of about 500,000 highly vulnerable homes which were always getting flooded. And they were struggling to get insurance, and a very innovative program called Flood Re was developed, which broadly speaking said that everyone buying insurance in the UK would have to spend 10 extra pounds to put into a pot that would help to effectively subsidise and protect those communities who were heavily exposed in some areas so that they could continue to get affordable insurance. And that was a good way of mutualising and sharing the risk. But it did come with some conditions. It came with conditions that no homes, for example, could be built within flood zones. And if they were, they wouldn't be able to access this type of protection. And if they couldn't access this protection, people can't get mortgages, so people can't buy homes. So I won't go into all the other sort of techniques and attributes which are helping to define more resilient building codes. But I suppose what we need to do is retrain the invisible hand of economics to take account of this risk so that we are helping to encourage funding and support to go into the right direction in a rational way. And with that, I'll hand back to you in the studio.
Thanks so much, Rowan. You just reminded me that, you know, when we were buying a property in Washington, D.C., I was told by the realtor, you know, you need to buy insurance, and part of that you had to understand whether you were in a risk-prone area or not, which means that information on flooding, because DC is built, you know, the joke in DC is it's built in a swampland, which basically means, you know, we built areas where we shouldn't have been building, but of course that was how things were built in the past. And that now has an impact on flood risk today. So, thank you for articulating it and helping us, you know, just making that individual decisions that we are making sometimes are contributing, or our own decisions have to understand risk if we can, and data is needed to help understand that risk. We're going to move a little bit now to the whole energy transition sector. We've got Ms. Jinsun Lim from IEA. And Jinsum, I think, you know, we've had some conversations in the past, and it's also come up several times in this forum that we are going through an energy transition. That means we're building an incredible amount of new infrastructure, which is new in all kinds of ways. You know, we're building solar, we're building wind farms. A lot of that is newer technologies where the codes and standards may or may not exist. So I think and the importance of electricity system. I think resilient infrastructure, the whole importance of the power sector being secure during an event can make a difference whether an event becomes a disaster or not, right? So on the crucial role of resilient electricity systems in safeguarding public health, let's take the example of hot weather, you know, extreme weather. We're dealing with extreme heat. RO has already pointed out, we've already gone past 1.5. So on the crucial role of resilient electricity systems in safeguarding public health during hot weather, can you throw some light on the existing disaster risk data or information mechanisms that are currently accessible for informing energy system managers?
Thank you very much, Amit. Yes, as we talked about many different cases, which has already made a significant progress in terms of the accessibility and accuracy of the climate hazard data and disaster risk data. And related to the heat waves, it's indeed, although it's not completely proven by case studies, but there are really shocking anecdotes what happens during the heat wave if there is a power outage happens. And there is a notable increase in terms of the mortality rate, and also there is a increasing disruption in terms of the healthcare services. And those kind of climate risk data, we have some availability in different international organizations and also the government agencies. For example, IEA is providing the weather for energy tracker data, which is providing the key indicators from the IPCC CMIP6 models, and try to select some of the key indicators to provide some overview of the climate risks related to the energy supply. And also, I understand that UNDRI and also the CDRI is providing a very significant and impactful case studies as well. And of course, UNESCO, WMO, and also the multilateral development banks, they are developing different analysis related to the energy and climate risks as well, and also mapping systems.
Can I push you a little bit more? Because, you know, yesterday you were telling me about the whole, there is a certain, when you look at global models, they're pointing you in a certain direction, but when you start breaking it down, you remember you were telling me something? Why don't you share that with the audience?
Yes, actually, I wanted to share with the second question. So yes, we made a really significant progress in terms of the overall accuracy and overall accessibility of the climate risk in general. But I want to really emphasize the translation and interpretation of the available data is really the key. And I saw that already the previous speakers pointed out these kind of context and locality will be a really key issue. And for instance, India, according to the IPCC assessment report, the 6 assessment reports, the newest data, you will experience a little bit wetter climate with the increasing risk of a heavy rainfall and flood risk. And then we automatically think about, okay, we need to concentrate on the flood protection measures. But actually, when we look at in really detail to make the energy project planning decision-making process, then you will find out this is not the full picture. The first of all, we need to think about the geographical variability, of course, that what kind of climate hazard will happen in certain area. And the second thing is about the temporal variability, when the precipitation will happen, when the floods will happen. And also, we need to think about the technical vulnerability. So you can imagine that those kind of floods risk will not have the same impacts on the, for example, electricity grids, and also against the huge thermal power plants, which has a really strong flood protection measures in usual. And we need to also think about some interlinkage with other socio-economic factors. I would like to give one example. Even for the hydropower, so if we are expecting some wetter climate and with an increasing availability of water, it does not necessarily mean the hydropower generation will increase. Because we need to think about the water availability depending on the population growth, depending on the water pumping demand from the society for the industrial demands, and also the forestation and also the changes in the land use due to the urbanization. So those kind of issues should be considered for the calculation of the climate risk in detail. And also other climate factors such as the increasing the rate of the melting snow and the glacial will affect the water availability depending on the seasons. So these kind of assessment, actually we received the kind of shocking results that the hydropower generation from the India existing hydropower plants is likely to decrease slightly by about 5%, despite the weather, climate, and also the higher flood risks. So I would like to share that those kind of interpretation and translation of the existing information is very important.
Thank you so much for helping us break down where there are global models that are telling you something, but once you start to come down to localizing that information, you may be looking at something completely different. And when Aromar talks about the risks profile are changing and the hydromet risks are changing, and we're looking at, for example, at the energy sector here, just as an example, where you've got precipitation changes which are maybe pointing in one direction, but the energy that you're using, and if you're relying on renewable energy and you're relying on hydropower, well, that may be going in the same direction or not, and you need to understand that, because you're also having to see, supply that energy at a higher, extreme heat. There are a lot of other factors that are increasing the demand on energy. So in this new space of energy transition, one needs to also look at data much more carefully to understand the risks that are from the hydromet risks that are changing, the risk profiles that are changing, and how those are getting localized. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to shift now to Professor Ravi Sinha, actually. Professor Ravi Sinha, I trained as an urban planner, and one of the things that we learned in the US was, or actually generally, Why did we have fire codes? It was a response to fires. You know, you have a disaster, you have an event, and you get into standards and codes so that that event doesn't happen again. So the whole role, and we also heard this from Mark Harvey, where there was an understanding of past events of tidal risk that led to stronger codes to ensure that the infrastructure was prepared for 1 in 300-year flooding. So there's a whole role that risk information plays in improving codes and standards. Professor Sinha, you've been working in the earthquake field for a very long time. You're an esteemed professor at one of India's premier universities. In the past 2 decades, how have you seen disaster risk information play a role in the development of improved standards and codes? And then specifically, how has disaster risk information contributed to advancements in creating more resilient infrastructure?
Yeah, so am I audible? Thank you. So this is an incredibly important issue. While we talk about resilient infrastructure, the delivery has to be by the technical people, the engineers and other who would implement the development of those projects or the retrofitting of existing assets. So the question is that how do they go about achieving it? And the whole reason why we are talking about retrofitting, say earlier built infrastructure, is because at that time we had less knowledge, so the knowledge had to be increased. And today we know that they are deficient. And which also means that unless we have a way of tackling future risks, the infrastructure we are going to build today are going to be found wanting. So there has to be a way in which this entire cycle of improvement in knowledge translates into better infrastructure. And this is all done through enhancements or improvement in the standards to which the infrastructure is to be built. And this is both the physical infrastructure as well as the cyber physical infrastructure. Generally what happens is that the standards are developed or improved from 2 sources of information, either because of advancements in science. So a good example could be, say, 4G communication technology giving way to 5G communication technology, almost entirely driven by advancement in science. And the second one is evidence of shortcoming. And in the case of disaster risk, almost the entire drive to improve science is because of evidence of shortcoming. In disaster after disaster, we see that the performance has been inadequate and resulting in losses which are unacceptable. And because of that, there is a pressing need to re-examine what the standards are specifying, why they are deficient, and how to go about improving it. So it's like a circular process. Every disaster reveals new information of shortcomings. They reveal lack of knowledge. The scientific community gets down to understanding where they went wrong in the past. New science is developed, and based on that, new technologies get developed, new methods get developed, and they are brought into the standards. So standards and learning from past disasters, they are very, very strongly linked in the field of resilience. Now in this, I would just like to say one thing related to this issue, and that is that some of the natural disasters like earthquakes, cyclones or hurricanes, tsunami, the kind of forces which they unleash are staggering, and they are way beyond the ability of humankind to replicate today. So no laboratory in the world, no you can say scientific setup in the world would be able to replicate those kinds of forces to learn from them. The only way to learn from such disasters is by being there and observing what has worked, what has not worked, and use that as a lesson. And these cannot be local lessons, they are always global lessons. And in this regard, I would like to request G20 to consider this as part of the agenda, that as part of knowledge sharing, can this also be a platform for knowledge generation at the global level? So disasters in some corner of the world also become like a laboratory to learn for the people from other parts of the world. So they all gain, because disasters don't come frequently, but when they do come, they are able to provide lessons for everyone. So this is just a request to consider that can the disaster learning be a part of the agenda of the common G20 platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sinha, for highlighting that last part, because I think that has not yet come out in the discussions. I think we've all acknowledged that there are disasters happening around the world, but the fact that we can also spend some time as a group maybe thinking about how do you learn from one part. We're doing the learning, but we're doing the learning where it's not in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. It's actually much later. And if there is a mechanism also to think about where, we have had flooding, we have had earthquakes, we've had wildfires on a very regular basis, and is there a way for a mechanism to learn from them immediately and then share that through this platform? And I think, Kamal, that's sparked with you for future thinking. We're going to shift now towards, because the whole discussion actually has been around finance, and I'm happy to have somebody here who's spent some time at least on the green bond side, but also, hopefully can help us understand a little, or spend a little bit more time linking data to finance in this conversation. Ms. Vikas, as a recipient of the prestigious Sustainability Leader of the Year award and a member of the Global Advisory Board for several financing agencies dedicated to mobilizing more than 100 trillion bond market for climate change solutions, I would like you to emphasize the significance of data in enhancing these new and emerging climate investments. This is all a new space, right? Could you provide an example of a case where data has played a pivotal role in improving such climate investments?
Thank you, Amit. Thank you very much for that question. I'm going to put out a lender's or a financier's perspective, really. So, obtaining necessary data and information to identify climate vulnerabilities, estimating change, or even monitoring impact when it comes to financing, as it is, this is a very difficult task. And on top of all of this, the lack of these measures affects the need of financial institutions to prioritize and channelize capital towards those sectors which are either conventional, so easy to finance, risks are understood very well, or those which are high on ROI, return on investment, right? Therefore, data does play a significant role, and as I was sitting in and listening to so many of these conversations, I think, it will enable finance, and given the sheer scale of finance that is required at one level, the frequency of the disasters that are happening, I think there are gaps, and then there are solutions that we need to look at. If I put out some of the gaps, and that's really for all of us to think, I think one is the limiting factors like lack of authentic, factual, accurate, granular, quantitative data that is required by lenders to make analysis, or even the data integration systems. I'm so glad that ISRO has that model, and if that, a professor asked him about who can use that, I think bankers would be the first to put their hands up to apply those models if that's available publicly. But lack of this does hinder decision making and scare away financial flows, if I may put it that way. The second is, financial institutions often struggle to navigate disaster risks, understand the risk factors, and also translate these risks into pricing, because ultimately it's all about pricing, right? And that's also on account of poor data availability. Then there are lack of incentives or risk covers, or the ease to access these risk covers, many a times that do not motivate capital flows to come to vulnerable sectors because there's uncertainty of return on investment. And then there are lack of skill sets by people who are sitting within financial institutions, the risk and credit officers, they not at times understand the complex financial risks or transition risks or physical risks for that matter, which serve as deterrents. And then there is also a lack of financial frameworks that guide and support DRR structures for its integration in the risk and the valuation methodology or the frameworks, right? And I just want to cite an example here. Given that banks have exposure to infrastructure as a sector, which has, such a big risk from these kind of incidences, the standard asset provisioning norms that banks have to look at, they don't include disaster as a category, which needs to go there. And lending is very much based on financial feasibility and not really focused on these kind of targets, right? So what is it that we need to do? And very quick last 2 points. I think strengthening systems and processes that are interactive, which need large-scale investments. I think, channelizing large-scale investments for DRR systems, that not only provide authentic and granular data, timely data, but I think it's also important to look at data integration systems, especially for financial institutions, which gives a kind of a unified view or gain actionable intelligence. Because many a times what is seen is projects remain in the pipeline as they fail to provide sufficient justification for, say, climate or disaster rationale, and lack the resources and capacity to provide evidence. Therefore, there are very few projects that are really bankable. And therefore, investing in data systems would enable the means to manage and address DRR, enhance development of robust financial systems, and better access to newer finance that you mentioned about. An example here, and that's really good, the Commonwealth Secretariat's Common Sensing Project, I don't know if you've heard of this, but that involves the Pacific Island states using common sensing platforms, geospatial-based Earth observation data to develop evidence-based climate finance proposals, and which are resultantly much more bankable, and providing them enhanced finance. So I think, we need these investments in these kind of systems. And I think the second point and last is on the processes. I think diagnostic processes involving the ecosystem to identify priority indicators, secure necessary resources, and garner technical assistance. And I think the G20 is quite capable of doing that. I think that is really very, very critical. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know I understand that, we're throwing a lot of things at you right now, including I'm sitting here and trying to absorb everything that's coming and trying to even summarize that is not easy. But in a way, I think the reason we are also trying to do this is, there are certain things that are very immediately obvious. Capacity gaps. You just mentioned capacity gaps in the financial sector to even understand the risk data. Investing, you're already investing currently where you understand the risk. But we are also dealing with, climate change is bringing newer risks which are hard to understand. So on the data side, one needs to start thinking about how do you put that data together. Dr. Sinha also articulated that it's not easy to understand these forces. So the whole role of modeling, probabilistic modeling, there are now new ways of understanding that risk that also has to get translated through capacity building for a variety of different audiences. Rowan, I'm going to come back to you, and I recognize we only have about 7 minutes left. So maybe there's a lot of rich information here. 2 minutes to summarize your thoughts and some direction that you would like the audience here at G20 to think about.
Absolutely. I used the phrase earlier, I think, getting the physics into finance, and I thought Namita summarized things so well along with the other panelists. With the help of CDRI, obviously, Amit, that you've been driving with others, CDRI is producing a really fabulous open database called GIRI that we in the Insurance Development Forum are also contributing to in a collective initiative called the Global Resilience Index. And the aim there, at a global level, but at quite high resolution, so it can be useful for public and private institutions, is to provide the hazard data, i.e. what the climate and weather is going to be like in the future, as well as seismic risk, but marry that with actually the hardest data to find, which is details on the exposed environment of assets and natural capital, as well as populations and their, particularly their vulnerabilities. And what I'm excited about is it's taken seemingly 10 or 15 years, but now the right capabilities and resources are being mobilized, in part through initiatives like the G20 and the CDRI and the UNFCCC. So I would say that within the next year or two, much of the data that people are looking for will become more available. The challenge then, and it was touched on by a number of the other speakers, is then integrating that into the decision systems of your industry, your sector, and ultimately your company or organization. That's actually the last mile and the hardest thing, to link it into the very core business processes that we all have in our own sectors. So I would say that geography is about to become almost as important as economics, and there's some great work being done, including under the G20, to begin to make this material open, accessible, and available. And it's really great that this is now coming together, and thanks to CDRI, amongst other initiatives, for driving that bus very practically and, may I say, generously. Over to you, Amit.
Thanks so much, Rowan, for those thoughts. And I completely agree. I think the modeling and the data and the ability to understand risk has become a lot more sophisticated and should get better. I think how we start to use that is the really next frontier we need to start tackling as well. So on that, some thoughts from you, Jinsun.
Thank you. As we talked about, the translation, interpretation of the climate and disaster risk information and data is not so easy. It cannot be really done by a single actor. For example, when we try to translate the data for the energy project, we have a good data about the energy technical vulnerability, their location and everything, but we are really shocked, okay, we need to think about the land use changing, population growth, industrialization, urbanization, those kind of factors, we don't have the knowledge. So I really believe that the governments and the G20 and the participating international organization, they have a really key role to lead and coordinate this kind of studies to be integrated and translated into the real decision-making process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Sinha?
Yeah, I fully agree. And in fact, I would like to again make a suggestion that earlier during the day, we saw the plan for data platforms being developed under the aegis of G20 to see whether these data platforms could be extended or enhanced so they also meet sectoral needs, including those for the people from the field of finance, from the field of insurance, from the field of engineering, and so on. So that perishable data, they have a single repository from which people who are concerned with that particular field can go and draw the data. Right now, data is, first of all, not easily available. If it is available, people are often not sure about the quality of the data. And even if the quality gets assured, the data is often incomplete. So having sanitized or verified data for each sector on a specific platform would be really, really useful, and it would help to make the understanding of disaster risks much better than what it is today at a much faster rate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Namita?
I think I would put it out as two things. I think at a policy level, we need far more integration when it comes to DRR kind of measures, right? So, for example, in India, we have something called the priority sector lending, where banks need to lend 40% of their book towards certain sectors. Now, social infrastructure does fall into this category, but there's nothing called disaster ex ante covered I think if that's actually put in, then it becomes a case for financial institutions or banks to channelize capital. So I think from a policy standpoint, we need to comb through policies to see how integration can be worked out. On the product side, we have seen catastrophe bonds or resilient bonds that have been issued but not very successful, and we need to really look at the challenges that they have faced. So, how do you risk the probability? I think those kind of models are not really there with financiers, and therefore we're not able to issue many of those bonds. But look at how we can push those bonds with DFIs backing this kind of funding. Cross-border mobility of finance, I think that's very important. So domestic capital and cross-border capital as far as developing markets are concerned, I think how can they bring investments into these kind of projects, I think that's very, very important to look at. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to end with, making a case for banks to prioritize lending for resilient infrastructure. And I think that's the next challenge for this group. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you for the panelists for being here. And thank you for the online participation as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Mr. Douglas. And thank you, Ms. Jinson and Professor Sinha and Ms. Namita for your wonderful remarks and discussion. I now invite the Chairman DRR Working Group to give his concluding remark. Okay. So the next session is going to be taking place in the same room as where we were in the morning. So it's on to my left and to your right. So it's 2 doors from here. Meanwhile, please request you all to please grab a cup of tea or coffee and meet us in the next room for the roundtable discussion on finance. Thank you.